Funding for UCSD TV's coverage of the Partners for Smart Growth Conference is provided by the Urban Land Institute, a nonprofit education and research institute that studies real estate development and land use. Its mission is to provide leadership in the use of land in order to enhance the total environment.
I want to welcome you to the final plenary session of this conference. I hope those of you who are not staying for Western States have enjoyed it. It's been immensely informative to me, and I hope to all of you. We've had some great speakers, and we're favored this afternoon to having two great governors who are leaders in the smart growth movement here to share their insights with us in our final plenary session. First, I'd like to introduce the governor of Utah, Michael Leavitt, who was born Governor Leavitt was born and raised in Cedar City, Utah, earned a bachelor's degree in business and economics from Southern Utah University, and is past president and chief executive officer of a large regional insurance firm. He's been a member of the Utah State Board of Regents, which oversees Utah's 9 colleges and universities. Governor Leavitt was elected in 1992. He co-authored in Libra, a new shared doctrine for environmental management that provides common sense tools for protecting the environment and its natural resources. He has held regional and national leadership roles, serving as past chair of the Republican Governors Association and the Western Governors Association. Governor Leavitt is currently chairman of the National Governors Association. Welcome, Governor. A few planes close. This must be the naval base. Governor Glendening, Governor Parris Glendening, overcame a childhood of poverty in Florida to become the 59th governor of the state of Maryland. Educated at Florida State University, he received a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in political science and urban administration. He taught government and politics as a professor at the University of Maryland for 27 years. Governor Glendening was elected to the County Council of Prince George's County, Maryland in 1974, and in 1982 was elected county executive, where he served 3 terms. In 1994, he was elected governor of Maryland, and in 1998, Governor Glendening easily won re-election to a 2nd term. Governor Glendening is vice chairman of the National Governors Association. And once again, our moderator, Curtis Johnson. Curtis, thank you.
Welcome to all of you. We're going to have a little discussion up here for a few minutes, and then probably before you know it, we're going to be asking you, if you're interested, to find your way to one of these microphones so that you can get in on the discussion with our 2 distinguished governors today. To get us going, if you would indulge me just a moment, this issue has been getting hotter every one of the last few years. And it's been riding a wave of states passing one kind of law or another that addresses the challenge of how we're going to manage our growth. It began to get into more big stage politics about a year ago. And then all of you may recall when Vice President and presumptive presidential candidate Al Gore threw out this livability agenda, and it was like throwing out a gauntlet. And it seems that in the months that have passed, realizing that we are in the early stages of silly season now leading up to the next presidential combat, but there's been a kind of philosophical pirouetting going on, a dividing up into camps, and every sort of danger that this delicate and very complex issue could just become another form of partisan roadkill. I mean, just stop and think about the voices that you hear. On the left, you hear recurring voices about the nobility of planning. You know, we ought to really be looking out for where we're going, making a plan. The right, on the other hand, celebrates choice. the raw power of markets to determine what people really want. The voice on the left then is saying, but don't you have to pay attention to fairness? Opportunity does not fall equally on everybody else. Don't we have to intervene there? The right says, wait a minute, no free rides. The left then is over here beating the drums to get more transit out there and to shift the way we spend transportation dollars. The right's saying, oh, come on, people love their cars. What we really need is bigger and better roads. On the left, you hear a lot of sometimes righteous talk about the sterility of suburbs, those barren manufactured places, seamless subdivisions devoid of sidewalks, wholly dependent on automobiles to get people anywhere they want to go. And then if you listen from the right, you hear more about the decay, the deterioration, the utter despair and hopelessness of the core cities, bad schools, crime running rampant. Who in the world would want to live there? On the left, you hear about the loss of 400,000 acres. Sierra Club talk. On the right, they say, well, wait a minute. 50 years of sprawl, it's only occupied 1% of the nation's footprint. The whole developed land, including roads, is only 5% of the footprint. What are we worried about? The left says, yeah, but some of it's cropland, and we got to feed people. And the right says, yeah, but cultivation is up 8% since the 1960s. And on and on and on, this ritual dance seems to go, with every danger that the debate gets itself totally deadlocked. And yet there are some signs, like the 200-some measures that passed in the last election, totaling up to some $7 billion of measures, all about some aspect of smart growth. When you read that Ralph Reed is for it, you at least pause and think about it. When you read that Paul Weyrich thinks that transit is a fiscally conservative strategy, there are obviously some breaks in the otherwise deadlocked dike. Well, here we have in front of us today's leader and tomorrow's leader of the National Governors Association. So the first thing I'd like to pose to you is, in the good audience and the good offices of that distinguished organization, is there anything you are doing or can do to keep this issue from just sliding into the ditch of partisanship and being so much roadkill?
We defer to our chair here, who will handle it brilliantly. Yes.
A little more.
At our last meeting of the National Governors Association, which would have been in St. Louis in August, we adopted a policy that placed the National Governors Association in the position of having adopted what we refer to as in Libra. It was mentioned earlier. In Libra is a Latin word which is in, to move toward, and Libra, balance, to move toward balance. It can best be, this was a doctrine that was actually written on a bipartisan basis. It was designed to establish a group of principles that could become a shared doctrine. Now, I've been reading a book. Curtis and I were talking about a book I read called Getting to Yes. It's a book, I think, by Roger Fisher, who is at the Harvard Business School, and it's on negotiation. And he talks about the two different kinds of negotiations, one being interest negotiation, where you start basically at two extremes and then try to bargain each other to the middle, or bargain the other one depending on how hard you're willing to bargain. And another kind of negotiation he refers to as principled negotiation. A very important part of that whole process is to come up with a set of principles upon which the negotiating parties are able to agree. In Libra is a bipartisan effort to develop a set of principles, a shared doctrine. Now, I became quite convinced this was necessary one day in Salt Lake City. I pulled up at an intersection, and there are two bumper stickers in front of me, one on each car. The one on the left said, "Earth first, we'll mine the other planets later." And on the right was a bumper sticker that said, "Save the Earth, kill yourself." I'm thinking somewhere in between those places is where the vast majority of the American public are. And it's, as I press people in my experience to say, what is your environmental philosophy? They basically say, I want balance and I'd like good stewardship. So the National Governors Association, in a very clear effort to find ways of being able to use sound principles, to a shared doctrine, we've laid out in Libra. Now, we haven't the time, unless you'd be interested in following up, on what the 8 principles are, but I'll give you an example. Examples such as national standards, neighborhood strategies. Now, here's an acknowledgement that many times you do need to have national standards in order to motivate, but 90+% of all action environmentally is ultimately implemented at the local level. So you've got to have local strategy. So the whole idea is for us to keep it bipartisan by agreeing on a shared doctrine that I believe 80% of the American public buy.
You know, insiders say that you know, a lot of things come before the National Governors Association, some of which you just do this too, and staff generates things, but the talk is that this agenda came really from the governors. What are you hearing that makes this a top drawer issue? Because you can't afford to spend time on something that isn't a big thing with the folks.
Well, let me just say, and it also adds on what Mike said here, and that is, you know, interestingly, this is not, as it was just a few years ago, something that you could put in a particular label and say, this is either liberal or conservative or whatever. It has truly crossed all partisan boundaries. It is not a urban or rural, and it's not a north or south or east or west. It's a tremendous issue that in many cases is coming from the community up. And being sensitive governors that we are, we recognize what the community is saying. And it was interesting when I said it's not a partisan issue. Shortly after after Governor Barnes got his wonderful program through in Georgia, which was an entirely different approach and somewhat surprising to many people, because not just that Georgia had been somewhat conservative, but the southern states traditionally have not been as aggressive in terms of government actions with regard to land use. And I called him and he said the interesting thing was his margin of vote came from Republican suburban legislators whose people were saying that they couldn't take the congestion anymore and had to do something. That was the key margin. And I say this because what has happened here, I think, is a movement. We recognize there is no one answer, but we recognize if we continue to do what we're doing now without some changes in policy, the quality of life is going to deteriorate significantly. And I think what we're seeing is a response in many different ways that also even says things like, if you think about it as an environmental issue, then people say, well, isn't that sort of, as you said, left and progressive or whatever? But this is just as important in terms of a fiscally conservative issue. We can't afford the cost of sprawl. We can't afford the highways and the new schools and everything, the water and sewer lines and everything that goes with it. And so I think what you're seeing here is an issue that is emerging. It's probably going to be one of the dominant issues of the first decade of the new century. We're going to see a lot of experimenting. We're going to see different approaches to it. But the net result is, I believe, we'll see some significant changes in policy.
Is, you know, interesting that you mentioned Georgia, because that's one of a list of states that had, I think what most people think is a very decent growth management law for a long time, but it was like a wonderful vase into which no one put any flowers. You know, they didn't do anything with it. They didn't put any resources alongside of it. And now all of a sudden it comes along with a fury and an energy that bypasses everything everybody else is doing. And in their case, it was, as you just said, Governor, traffic. Is traffic the hot button the people are pressing that's getting the attention of governors?
I think it varies with state to state. In most cases, traffic and congestion is a major issue, and I think there's an increasingly awareness that you can't simply build more roads and solve the congestion problem. We have a wonderful road in Maryland, Route 270, which is currently 16 lanes across, and half a dozen times a day it becomes one of the nicest parking lots you ever want to see in the state. And we are now building both mass transit and commuter rail parallel with this, and believe it will have a significant impact. We just canceled a $1.5 billion road that was going to run in the same general corridor because we recognize the roads will not by themselves solve the problem. But I think there are other things. In the case of Maryland, it's great concern about the Chesapeake Bay. We know that to protect the bay, we've got to take action on the land, and it's a sprawl on the land that is destroying the forest with their retaining ability, that's causing the silting and everything else that we have to address. And so that's the motivating force, I think, in Maryland as much as anything. But I know, because we're working on very much on a bipartisan and, as Governor Ventura would say, on a multi-party basis. Now, I also want to tell you, by the way,
politest way he'd ever put it.
He was at the last meeting and contributed very, very substantially to the problems of sprawl that he was having right there. And it was interesting. He simply said on transportation, remember the statement? He said, when the big debate came, do we add 2 additional lanes to the bridge to solve the traffic problem? He said, I knew something was wrong. So, I mean, we've been very much involved in this together.
Okay. Let me stick with you for just a moment, since you mentioned 270. You recently made some news canceling a major road project, an inter-county connector, much sought after by people who are worried about these parking lots that the freeways have become. And I understand you did that largely for the environmental threat that it represented, going through very fragile parklands and so forth, not so much because of transportation or traffic. Is the consciousness now high enough in Maryland on this issue that you can actually cancel a road project and live to see tomorrow's politics?
We should also remember now, when we say cancel, this project has been on the books for 50 years. We have spent as a state $62 million studying the project.
It's like Freddy Krueger, it just never goes away.
That's exactly right. If you're a traffic engineer and consultant that does these studies, you love this road. You love this road. I mean, you study it forever and you never build it. But if you're serious about transportation issues, then 2 things happened. The environmental costs were simply too great, and it was clear the federal government would never give its approvals, and I think rightly so. But secondly, it was also clear that superhighways going through urban areas are no longer going to be the way, I think, to solve transportation problems. And we are expanding significantly investments in mass transit as well as transportation management. We'll be having some significant announcements of additional commuter rail as well as subway extensions, putting a very, very significant investment in mass transit. Now, again, each state is different. In Maryland, we have about 75% of our population in the Baltimore-Washington corridor, and so we can talk about mass transit in a way differently, perhaps, than other states can, but the real thrust behind this is it wasn't going to work, it wasn't going to be approved, it was bad environmental policy, let's use the money to build mass transit instead.
Very good. Governor Leavitt, while several speakers at this conference have confirmed the emerging wisdom now that it really is metropolitan regions where the action is. Mm-hmm. They're the new platform for the new economy. They're the market for just about everything that we try to measure. And as Peter Calthorpe said this morning, in your state, it's even the way people identify with community now. Right. And yet, the record shows so far that these metro areas don't seem to be able to work their way out of this trap. Nearly nowhere do we have serious metropolitan governmental machinery, even though we have a sea of local governments everywhere. The state seems to be the emerging instigator here. The state, passing a law, setting a framework, changing the policy environment. Is that what we must look to now? I mean, is the state the critical starting place to do something about the growth agenda?
One of the principles of Libra is that that environmental solutions transcend political boundaries, and that it will require a great deal of cooperative work. Now, there may be places, the debate you referred to earlier, I think exists everywhere. On one hand, you have the new urbanist, who is absolutely certain, unless you have a growth czar and can use the compulsive power of a government, that you cannot solve these problems. On the other hand, you have the libertarian view, which is that we're going to use markets for it. Every state is different. I can tell you that in our state, using the state as the unit of planning simply will not work. There is an ethic that is so deeply inbred in the sinew of every, I think not just Utahn, but Westerner, is that we're not going to use the state as that means. I believe the mantra, if you will, of the 21st century in many ways will be central coordination but local control. It's where we are we're coordinating our information, but we're maintaining a sense of local control. The world has, to throw this model a little further, we have used a kind of mainframe mentality in everything we have done in the past, but the world is beginning to work like a group of networked PCs. And that's the way I think environmental policy and problems will have to be solved in the future. We have independent sources of processing power, cities, counties, etc. The state's role really is to be the network, to create the rules and the standards by which these all operate. We passed what we referred to as the Quality Growth Act last year of 1999 in our last session. It essentially said we're not going to subsidize sprawl anymore. If you want to borrow money, you can borrow money from the state, but it's not going to be at 0% interest. We're prepared to spend money to build a sewer into an area, but if you're not going to increase the density in a general area, we're simply not going to do it. So the state, I think, is becoming really the setter of parameters, the vehicle of central coordination, but maintaining these networked PCs of local governments to work out their own combinations.
Your description of that sounds an awful lot like Maryland's 1997 law. Are there any important differences? You copied it.
Yeah.
Okay. And
He acknowledged it. Right. I must add, though, that Mike's been modest on one important point there, and that is even if you have local decision-making, I think increasingly it takes state leadership to move people in a certain direction. And in Libra approach that Mike's been the architect has is significant. The debate going on within the Governors Association under his chairmanship is significant. And the fact that in many states we are trying to do exactly what's suggested here, and that is say, okay, we understand basic land use decisions are local. But the way the system is set up now, you make the local decisions and then you turn to the taxpayer statewide to help pay for the sprawl or for the environmental damage that results from that. And our approach is one of incentives and disincentives. And what we're saying basically is if you make the wrong decisions, then you're going to have the responsibility, you, either local government and or private sector, but we're not going to subsidize that.
Well, just leaving aside for a moment the People's Republic of Portland and Oregon's really tough law, statewide land use law, if you just look at Washington State's law that has what feels like more mandates about criteria and timetables, and you've got to all submit these plans by a date certain and live with them. Even Tennessee, property rights happy, we don't want government into anything. Tennessee, has got these plans you have to have submitted now by January 1. Are you so convinced that incentives, just doing a new architecture of incentives, will get you where you need to go, or is it a step on the way to the next thing?
I would just say I hope it gets us there. If it doesn't, the nature of political pressure and human need will drive you to the next step. I think that incentives are the first place. Again, one of the principles of in Libra, markets before mandates. There may be times when you have to use mandates, but you ought to exhaust every market alternative before you do. And an incentive is a market tool. I find myself in I spoke. Each of the governors have an opportunity to render a state of the state each year. 2 years ago, I spoke in the State of the State about two of my core political principles that are being placed at conflict. One is local control. I deeply believe in local control. The other is you let the market work. The problem we're finding now, particularly in areas like housing, is that those are conflicting because we have local planning and zoning commissions that are essentially planning areas that are just havens for starter castles and trophy homes, and that's it. And they're not creating a sense of housing in every category, so you have young people who grow up in a community and then can't afford to live in the community where they grew up. Now, ultimately that will force the most conservative of state legislators to begin to respond. And in our state, where I think we are, is that we're now starting to talk about the fact that if you as a community are not willing to take some multi-unit housing, if you're not willing to have some moderate-priced housing, some starter homes, that's a problem. Everybody has a little bit of a responsibility, and perhaps the state is going to have to start apportioning responsibility.
Okay, now you're moving
That's right.
toward mandates.
And it is not something that, this is where this conflict comes.
Where can you get some political help with this? You know, when you say that, it reminds me of places where, well, we heard a lot in the last couple of days about Atlanta hitting the wall, and the business community, they're roaring out of the woodwork to mount the task force and push for political change and really give Governor Barnes all of the support he needed to get this thing through the legislature. Reminds you of the Silicon Valley Manufacturing Group that is so concerned about the issues that you just raised. They show up at Planning Commission hearings of local government and testify for the affordable housing that they need to keep the economy from stalling out. I mean, how is it important to get the ministers of the economy, the business representatives to show up and say that this is not merely a matter of social justice, but this is a matter of the intact economy?
I think it's extremely important, but I would first add a quick comment about whether this is just going to be incentive-based. I think it's important to understand that this is not about adopting one law or one program. We got 40 to 50 years of sprawl and a variety of change in behaviors and incentives and policies and everything that got us to the point where we are. And I believe what we're going to see during the course of the next couple of decades is a series of experiments, of programs, of incentives, and of mandates. And we're going to constantly be trying to say, how can we redirect investment into existing communities? How can we preserve the open spaces? If things work with incentives, that's going to be great. If we have to go further, we're going to go further. Since we adopted our law in 1967, and some of our legislators are here, Delegate Bush, for example, from Annapolis, who just was a wonderful supporter of this, but since we adopted that program, we have added a half a dozen, and there are copies of this book available here as well. We've added a half a dozen additional tools. Some of them are requirements, and some of them are incentives. In the upcoming legislative session, we will take the next step in a couple of areas. Some of them are financial, like mass transit and putting additional incentives behind brownfield reuse. But some of them also will be by requiring changes in local building codes so that you can reuse and infill and add densities easier than it is today. There are many business people, including here, who would love to build either the multifamily or even reuse a building and find that there are so many obstacles that it's easier to go out there and tear down one more forest or one more farm. And so we're going to have a statewide revision. We're calling it a smart code. We found out smart growth works because otherwise you're for dumb growth. And so we figured out that this works, and so we're going to have a smart code. And if people don't like that, that means they're for the dumb code is what we're going to be arguing. But in a serious note, I anticipate during the course of the next decade that just about every legislative session we're going to see refinements, we're going to see additional incentives, but we're also going to see tightened mandates, requirements that certain things be done or certain things not be done. Now, specifically in terms of the business community, it is absolutely essential. We're all in this together. It doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about taxes and cost of government, or whether you're talking about the quality of life, or whether you're talking about the viability of our existing communities. We're all in this together. It's good environmental policy, but it's also good business policy. And the problem that we had in the past, and this is the very thing that Governor Leavitt is addressing here, is that we spent so much time just clashing with one another at public hearings and philosophical debates and all. And now I think what you're seeing is the people saying, wait a minute, let's stop some of the shouting and try to move in the same direction at one time.
Does business show up in Maryland at critical times?
They have on a number of the programs, and just as a quick example, some of our strongest advocates, and a couple of them were here on some of the panels, like Bill Strever out here, who have been strong advocates of reuse and investment in existing communities. At the local level, they have been very much there. During the last debate when we first adopted our law, they were not as involved one way or the other. Since then, a number of business organizations have been stepping up much more aggressively in support of this because, again, as I say, it just makes very, very good business sense. The other thing that's important is that the Maryland economy is absolutely booming now. In fact, we have the lowest unemployment rate ever in the history of the state, and we're now the third highest family income.
Owing to great leadership, I'm sure.
There's no question about that. But the reason I say that is I think it's starting to dawn on a lot of people that good land use policy, good environmental policy, good reinvestment in existing communities can also be good economic policy, good business policy. And we're doing both aggressively. And so I think that's probably the big mindset change that is going on right now.
Does business show up, Governor Leavitt?
Yes, but business always has mixed agendas. There are times that they resist. They show up to resist for logical reasons. I would like to just add that I believe one of the things that's driving this entire ethic is economic imperative. In an information-based economy, quality of life becomes a crucial part of attracting, maintaining, and building an economy. People who can think and can live anywhere they want will choose places that provide the quality that they would choose. And whereas in the past, a smokestack was a symbol of prosperity, today it's the absence of a smokestack that provides that same symbol. For high-tech industries, these are significant issues because they want to attract the kind of person who will live in these communities out of choice because they can live anywhere.
Exactly.
You know, if we could shift just for a minute, and then we're going to get the audience involved here. Americans must love local government because we have so much of it. And yet, if you get into a room with a lot of local government officials, and you've been one, Governor Glendening, you'll hear a bucket full of bad stories about people trying to do the right thing on this agenda and confronting a room full of red-faced, if not red-necked, citizens enraged about this or that new proposal and how they got shouted down and crowded into a corner and the oxygen went away and the proposal died. That's right. What have you learned, Governor Glendening, in the 2 years since you passed this law about how to help with this local pressure from the state level?
Let me say first about the part of the local officials. You know, you are absolutely right. If we're going to be successful in this, we must have higher densities at a certain point. We must make more effective use of transit stop locations. We must do infill development and reuse and so on. And there is a resistance to that. And as we put in our law to be a smart growth eligible area, so that the state would participate in the capital cost, you had to have a minimum of 3.5 units per acre. That's not extraordinarily high density by any means, but in many, many parts of the state, the norm is 5-acre or even 20-acre zoning. And so to say all of a sudden, you know, you got to have 3.5 acres, people were like, you know, it's just me 3.5 units per acre. They were all of a sudden reacting.
Revolution.
What we have found is in some areas, the local officials are using the guidelines and the incentives of smart growth and saying, listen, we've got to do this, and making some right decisions. In other areas, quite candidly, we are still facing fairly strong resistance. and I think still some very poor decisions. And when those decisions are made, they say, well, that's what the people wanted there. And so it's a mixed bag.
Do you have any situation so far in which the scenario plays out that the people want to do the thing the state doesn't want a jurisdiction to do? So if they're going to do it anyway, they're going to have to pay the whole bill, and that's going to translate into much higher taxes for everybody. Is anybody still saying yes, we're going to fly in the face of new state policy, we're going to go our way even if we have to pay the whole bill?
Unfortunately, yes. We have one interesting county in the state, and I won't go through it, but they've got extraordinary policies there. But in any case, they...
we don't have that many counties, Governor. We can figure it out.
24 counties, but in any case, they just rezoned a large farm out in the middle of their rural agriculture preservation area, totally outside of any smart growth area. And their statement was that the two brothers who owned the farm needed the higher density for their retirement, and they were well known in the county. I found that to be an extraordinary reason for opening up subdivision in a rural preserve area. We made it very clear in a formal sense that any roads or schools or any other improvements that are necessary as a result of that subdivision will be ineligible for any state assistance.
Hear, hear. But they were going to do it anyway.
A round of applause from a bunch of planners. That was impressive.
Pretty good. Pretty good. But can you see, Governor Leavitt, I mean, you made a pretty strong statement about the incentives are really the core of the strategy, and Western political cultures aren't going to move much off of that. If you got, I can imagine you getting a lot of the experiences Governor Glendening just described, where people express their Western individualism and say, this is my property and I'm going to do this with it no matter what the state policies are. Have you already thought about what you're prepared to propose if incentives don't work well enough?
I expect I'll be gone by then.
You're proposing retirement for yourself, huh? Well, imagine what your successor will have to do.
This is a general philosophy of mine. I think that those are driven by the body politic. You could not in our state impose a regional growth czar. They would be destroyed. I don't mean physically, but people would just go, ultimately they would, and I'm not talking about citizens, I'm talking about local governments who would simply not be willing to give up what they believe is a responsibility of theirs to define the shape and nature of their community. Now, someday if it gets bad enough, there will be an outcry and a demand.
Well, how much redefinition of the relationship can be tolerated between the state and the local?
It happens in increments. It doesn't happen all at once. If it happens too fast, it ultimately ends up wearing too hard. There's friction. And when friction causes chafe, and chafe causes sores, and politicians respond. And it just depends on which direction those are going. Now, clearly, there is an ethic of planning. In 1995, I held what we referred to as the Growth Summit in Utah. And it was actually a very interesting experience. We had a journalist by the name of Ed Fooey come out from the Pew Center for Journalism. And he did a grand civic journalism project. We asked the television stations in our state, the radio stations, the newspapers, all to block out parts of 3 evenings. I mean, you turn on the television, and there were 7 TV stations on this Growth Summit. It was covered by news programs. It was covered by newspapers. And it was all a discussion about how we can ultimately bring about the kind of quality we want in our community. It was the forerunner of this Envision Utah that you have, I think, had a presentation on. My point is that up until that time, open space was not a discussion anywhere in our state, but it was a topic of the Growth Summit, and it stimulated enough discussion to the point that it is now, by combination of that discussion and the fact that people are starting to see green patches disappear, it's becoming an ethic, and there is more and more interest and willingness to do that. This is not something you can just have great leadership at the top with and have some visionary plot a course that will ultimately cause them to plan their way into utopia. It just happens a little at a time as people are willing to accept it. But I believe the essence of good leadership in this case is to know when those issues are mature and to be willing to act, sometimes just a little ahead, but not a lot ahead.
I would add real quickly on the issue of kind of creating a ethos about dealing with sprawl and reinvestment and all. That's probably the most the extraordinary thing that is going on, and probably the most important thing that will happen, because it seems clear to me that there are two things, for example, that the public right now does not want. They don't want sprawl, and they don't want any more density in their neighborhood. And at some point, we've got to recognize responsibility is not just elected officials, but it's individuals as well. And we're going to have to come to grip with this. I use the analogy sometimes that I say that everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die to get there. And the same thing is true. No one has ever come up to me and said, I love sprawl, give me some more of it. But when you say, okay, now what this means is we're not going to permit these farms to be developed, or what it means is we need some higher densities here or some significant redevelopment with higher densities here. All of a sudden people say, well, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean exactly that. Now, what is happening, though, and I think this is probably the good news all across the country, there's more debate, more discussion, more people, not just elected officials, but people talking about how we're going to handle this than any time I can remember. And I've been in public office now since 1973. People are really concerned about it. I think most people acknowledge that there were a long way to go, but I think what is starting to emerge is a political ethos that says somehow or other we're going to have to make some fundamental changes to get there. I always give the analogy in terms of the Chesapeake Bay. We almost lost the Chesapeake Bay about 25 years ago. Then Governor Harry Hughes took some significant steps. The public became alarmed, concerned, and then became part of the solution. And today there's a political ethos, is the only way to describe it, that says save the bay. And so many policies are automatically evaluated. Does it have a good impact or a negative impact in Chesapeake Bay? When we first talked about our chairmanship, vice chairmanship, we went out in Maryland. The governor has a little boat, and we went out on the
boat, he calls it.
We went out on the bay and had lunch, and that is the political philosophy in the state. And what I think is happening is people are starting all over the country from entirely different perspectives and entirely different political philosophies saying, we can't continue this way. If you continue to do what you have been doing, you're going to have in the future what you have now, except worse.
For either of you, is this new ethos that's emerging, does it spill over into political support to more nearly balance investment between roads and transit? I mean, there are a lot of very congested regions around the world that you can still get around in because they balance their investments between transit and roads. We've never done that in the United States. Is it going to spill over into that, or is that still just an impossible mountain to climb?
Well, again, in the West, we have a very strong emotional attachment to our cars. But we are, on December the 4th, I will go on our first light rail ride. It's now complete. It was 6, 8, 10, I don't know how many years, a long time. And it was a hotly debated thing, and of course it will be interesting to see how the ridership actually plays out. People talk about Portland as being the kind of bastion of planning. They have planned on public transportation being 11%, I think is the number I was told, of their total ridership. We're counting on 14% of ours between public transportation and trip reduction. But we're still having to build roads. Yeah. Why? Because we just have a simple problem. We have certain stretches where there will be in the next 7 or 8 years twice as many cars. And it just causes all kinds of problems, particularly when you, and it's the planner's way to say we ought not to have highways, we ought to get mass transit, but the fact of the matter is you still have all these cars. And you really don't end up, in my judgment, you really end up responding often more than you do proactively moving.
I would just add, of course, it's different from each part of the country. In the East, I think we have far more potential because of the density of the population than you would expect in some of the Western states. But as a nation and as individual states and communities, we are not even close to what we should be doing in mass transit. Quite candidly, the highway lobby is still very, very strong. We spend about 95% of our construction money on roads. We are getting ready to as I said, make a significant additional investment in mass transit. But I will tell you this is what I think has to happen, especially in the East. We're going to have a time where we stop building some roads and stop widening some roads just because there are more cars, and instead say, okay, we're going to get serious about cost-effective and efficient, rider-friendly mass transit. And it's going to take a big change.
This audience is clearly friendly to that.
I don't think it will do. I don't think it will come about in any administration. You know, but I do remind people of this, and this goes back to my classes I used to teach in urban management. It was governmental policies, in large part, that got us to where we are. The interstate highway system, starting in 1954. And then you add to that the GI loan system, just opened up the suburbs, opened up the sprawl. If we had put anything close to the investment in mass transit that we put into interstate highway system, we would have a convenient, rideable system all across the country. And the other thing I'd mention is we have this double standard. You ride your roads, so to speak, for free, and yet when you get in mass transit, they say, well, transit's got to pay for itself, or it's got to be cost-effective in the fare box and all. And so we discourage people from doing this. And I think we need, like everything, like the whole approach that Mike is taking, we need a balance. And right now, we're not close to a balance in terms of investment in mass transit.
Questions from some of you? Microphone over there and over there. You might just tell us who you are and where you're from, so we have that first. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Bud Laurent. I'm from Santa Barbara, former county supervisor. So I associate a little bit with some of your comments about local folks. I want to begin by thanking both of you for coming here. I don't know how it was you were persuaded to spend your time with us, but it's really refreshing to hear such an informed discussion about such an important issue from two state leaders. And I hope the message isn't lost on our governor if he was invited to come here. But I hope you tell him the next time you have your National Association meeting how much you enjoyed the visit and how much we enjoyed you too. My question is this. I really enjoyed both your remarks, and especially about your observations about the tension between the market, this sort of organic thing we ascribe as the market forces, and regulation, and how somewhere there has to be an answer somewhere in between. My question to you is this. The power of your offices is perhaps the bully pulpit that you are both presently occupying, and I think that's a wonderful thing, and hopefully it'll happen here too. My question of you is, as the National Association of Governors, or in your own states, are you able to bring to the table the National Association of Home Builders and the building industry associations and those trade groups and the financial institutions who basically control most of the policy for land use in lots of different subtle ways and not so subtle ways, to try to get them to alter the market forces, because market forces are alterable by any number of things, including political will among those who control those basic fundamental decisions. I'd just like to hear what maybe you're doing in your state and maybe within the national organization.
One of the principles of Libra is collaboration, not polarization. I have never seen an environmental/growth problem resolved by sheer force, either by the use of law alone or by the the force of regulation. They're always solved by bringing the interested parties together and beginning to sort through and getting to a problem-solving place. Open space. Yes, I'm very heartened to tell you that open space is in large measure being dealt with now by developers in our state. We could not buy enough land publicly to solve that problem, so we're beginning to work with them to say, if you're going to develop something, we need you to help us create some open space. The real estate industry, working with us in the context of sprawl and density. They're very much interested in being able to see homes created in this. So open space community. I told a group earlier that there's only one thing that could cause me to abandon my passion for open space, and that would be for my daughter to have to move out of state because she couldn't get an affordable home. Suddenly I would be interested to see an alfalfa field turned into a subdivision, because that is higher on my priority list even than open space, as passionately as I feel about it. So I guess the point I'm making is, until you get all of the players at the table to collaborate, I don't think you can ultimately solve these problems. And I would argue again that that is a weakness of top-down leadership that simply does not work.
I would concur, and I'd just add real quickly that we are making great progress in a number of the committees and advisory groups and efforts as we bring our legislation together. Most of the main stakeholders have been involved. There are some areas that we don't have quite the involvement that I would like. The financial community, for example, is just starting really to step up, and that's crucial. But at the same time, even as I see great progress, it's frustrating at points. Let me just tell you one quick example. I expressed my great disappointment, and if the legislature concurs, it might be more than just a verbal expression. But one of our major health insurance plans in the state, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the president of whom, a person an African American, and I emphasize this because it's about Baltimore City, African American business person who chairs the Greater Baltimore Committee designed to stimulate the well-being of Baltimore City, made a decision to move a couple hundred employees out of the city into a new suburban office park. My question was, what in the world are you doing? You're supposed to be at the table working with us. You have, by the way, huge tax exemptions as a nonprofit insurance company here, and you're moving the employees out. I don't understand this at all. And his response was they could save almost $800,000 by locating this new office park. Well, first of all, we ought to be working to see what we can do to make that bottom line more workable, but that notwithstanding, it was clear to me that all of the efforts that had gone into a leadership being at the table on revitalization were lost on that one decision. And so I think we're going to continue to go through, sometimes really partnerships, really there, working it through together, and sometimes we're going to be clashing. I just hope we move more to the former and less of the latter.
Okay, let's move to this side over here.
Thank you. I'm Harriet Tregoning from Washington, D.C., and it strikes me that that the two of you, both prominent governors, both perceived as leaders on these smart growth issues in your state and in your parties, respectively, are, by happy coincidence, chair and vice chair of the National Governors Association. What are your plans during the term of your chairmanship and vice chairmanship to work with other governors around the country to help them address these important issues? And do you have any plans to reach out to members of Congress to help them reach the same kind of bipartisan accord that you seem to have reached?
I have a feeling that we are here today because of a panel that we participated in St. Louis on this very issue, where we had 5 or 6 governors that presented various things, and I think we ended up being the only 2 that could come today. But that was a discussion where different governors taking different approaches all laid their cards out and said, this is what we're doing, let's compare. That will continue. The major initiative that I will undertake during this period is a continuation of what I've just spoken of, but also the adoption of in Libra, which I've spoken of several times today, because I believe it has such a powerful potential to create this principled negotiation we've talked about in solving problems. This is fundamentally problem solving that we're doing, and negotiations and balancing between values. And so my main objective as chairman of NGA will be to create that shared doctrine. And before we're done today, I'm going to ask all of you to do me a favor, and that is to go home and add the word in Libra to your spell check. I think when we make a Microsoft spell check, in Libra will have arrived as a word. In case you've never heard the word, it's because we made it up. The great thing about making a word up is that you can make up the meaning, and that's what we've done. But it has taken some root, and we encourage you to, if you are interested, you can go to the National Governors Association website, and there's a full paper on in Libra, and I'd encourage you to read and understand the principles, and at some point in time, apply them as you get into a thorny problem. Say to people, let's see if we can come up with a set of shared principles here before we start, and how about we try these? And I think you'll find that they are principles that no one invented. We didn't invent them. They're just the product of 25 years of working with difficult environmental problems. If we haven't, I would say this, let me say one other thing. I believe our objective in the next 25 years needs to be twice the environmental progress at half the cost. We have learned a great deal in the last 25 years, but it's been very expensive and very slow and very contention-oriented. And if we're to have smart growth, we're ultimately going to have to get better at this. We've got to get better at this problem solving and better at doing it faster and less expensively.
Well, thank you, Governor Leavitt and Governor Glendening, for your high standards. Thank you for your high standards, your passion, and the time you spent with us, and thank you for participating. We're adjourned.
Funding for UCSD TV's coverage of the Partners for Smart Growth Conference is provided by the Urban Land Institute, a nonprofit education and research institute that studies real estate development and land use. Its mission is to provide leadership in the use of land in order to enhance the total environment. For more information, call 1-800-321-5011 or visit the ULI website at www.uli.org.